The human mind likes to make sense of things. We look for patterns and order in everything, even if it's not really there. Few things spark our interest in finding meaning more than when we stumble upon a coincidence. Many people believe they have to mean something, and whether or not these amazing coincidences are indicative of something supernatural or just bad luck doesn't really matter. They're all still pretty creepy. Number 10. The baby catcher. About 4,000 children per year under 10 are injured by falling from windows. That seems like a lot, all things considered, and it may be at the root of explaining the curious coincidence that befell Joseph Figlock back in 1938. According to reports, Figlock was a street sweeper in Detroit. He was walking down the street one day when a baby fell from somewhere above him in the building he was passing. The child landed on Figlock and injured both of them, but they both survived as a result. A year later, Figlock was cleaning out an alley, and a 2-year-old fell from a 4th-story window, once again landing on Figlock. The results were the same as before, with Figlock cushioning the fall and the child surviving. You may see this story retold with embellished details, such as the same baby landing on Figlock exactly 1 year later, and he caught it both times. The original reports didn't include those details at all, and in fact point out that one baby was a girl and the other was a boy. Number 9. Booth's brother saved Lincoln's son. People love to share eerie coincidences about Abraham Lincoln, whether or not they're always true. But there are some quirky facts about the president's life that do make you want to scratch your head, including the very odd coincidence about his son's near-death experience. Everyone knows that Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Less well known is how Edwin Booth, brother of John, saved the life of Robert Todd Lincoln. Like his brother, Edwin was an actor as well. Unlike his brother, he was actually a big fan of Lincoln and the Union. It was during the Civil War when Edwin and Robert met by chance in New Jersey. Neither knew the other personally, of course, and Robert was out on break from college while Edwin was traveling to see a friend. Robert was knocked off a train platform and fell down next to the train, which had started moving. Trapped, Robert suddenly felt someone grab him and yank him back up. He recognized Edwin Booth as being an actor, though Booth didn't know who Lincoln was. It was only a year or two later when John Wilkes Booth assassinated the president. Number 8. The life and death of George Story. George Story became famous from birth thanks to Life magazine. On November 23rd, 1936, the first issue of Life hit the stands. Inside the first issue, the very first photograph was of a doctor delivering a baby. The caption read, "Life Begins," which was a clever bit of wordplay for the magazine title. The baby was George Story. Throughout the years, Life would check in on George and run that photo again. The man himself grew up to be a journalist for some years. Life magazine stopped publishing in the year 2000. For the farewell issue, they were going to include one final photo of George with the caption, "A Life Ends." 2 days before the photographers showed up to take the photo, Story passed away from congestive heart failure. Number 7. The Nebraska church explosion. Choir practice at the West Side Baptist Church was scheduled to begin at 7:20 p.m. on Wednesday, March 1st, 1950. It always started at that time, so this was by no means an unusual event. What was unusual was that at 7:25 the church exploded. It's been suggested that after the furnace was lit in preparation for the choir's arrival, a gas leak may have caused the blast. It was powerful enough to blow the windows out of nearby buildings and even knock the local radio station off the air. And not a single person was hurt, because no one was there. Every single member of the choir was late that night, every single one of them for a different reason. Reverend Clem Bull, who lit the furnace, went home after to have dinner, but ran late when his daughter's dress got dirty and his wife was ironing a clean one. The church pianist fell asleep at home after her own dinner and woke up at 7:15. A high school student was stuck on a geometry problem with her homework. 2 other members couldn't get their car started. One man was stuck writing a letter and another was helping her mother. In total, 15 different people were late for 15 different reasons, such that there was no one in the church when it eventually blew. Number 6. The deaths of Bruce and Brandon Lee. Bruce Lee died in 1973 while filming his 5th movie, Game of Death. His death was caused by a cerebral edema in his brain and was all but unpredictable. He left behind a wife and 2 children. One of those children, Brandon Lee, famously followed in his father's footsteps by becoming an actor. As most of us know, Brandon Lee tragically died as well on the set of his film The Crow 20 years later in 1993. The Crow was Brandon's 5th film. His death was caused by a prop gun that was improperly prepared for use. The dummy rounds were made from altered live rounds, and one of the dummy bullets was still in the chamber when the blank was fired. This caused it to fire like a normal gun. In what turned out to be a bizarre coincidence, a scenario that almost exactly mirrored this turn of events happens on screen in Game of Death. In the film, Bruce Lee is playing an actor. On the set of the movie he's starring in, the prop guy explains to the cast and crew how to properly fire the prop gun. He explains that the gun is loaded with blanks, but that they must only aim upward because there's a wad of paper that could come out and injure someone. If the actor on the set of The Crow had followed those instructions, Lee would have survived. In his movie, Bruce Lee's character is then shot by the prop gun, though the character shooting intentionally swapped out the dummy round for a real bullet. The similarity between what happened on screen and what happened to his son 20 years later was eerily prophetic. Number 5. The death of Stephen Hawking. Ask the average person to name the greatest physicist of all time, and they'll likely only come up with a handful of names. Let's be honest, science isn't super glamorous, and fame isn't typically one of the perks, but that doesn't mean some of them don't achieve it. People like Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking are at the top of the list. And while their scientific minds likely wouldn't give much credence to weird coincidences, the rest of us can still do it. Hawking was born on January 8, 1942, and passed away on March 14, 2018. He was born on the 300th anniversary of famed astronomer Galileo Galilei's death. He died on the 139th anniversary of Albert Einstein's birth. It was also Pi Day, the day to commemorate the mathematical constant of pi, which is often abbreviated down to 3.14 or March 14th. As you can imagine, social media made no end of clever quips about the timing of Hawking's death, but even if it had no greater meaning related to relativity and time, it was still a bit of a fun coincidence. Number 4. The Tierney Man. A lot of sons follow in the footsteps of their fathers. That's sometimes a good thing, but not so for the Tierney family, however, who endured generational tragedy at the Hoover Dam. By the time the Hoover Dam was finished, 96 fatalities had been recorded. One of those deaths occurred on December 20th, 1921. George Gregory Tierney was caught in a flood and drowned in the Colorado River. Tierney left behind a family, which included his young son Patrick. 14 years after his father died, Patrick Tierney was a young man and had taken up work at the site of his father's death. It was December 20th, the anniversary of his father's death, when Patrick slipped from an intake tower. His death would be the final one associated with the building of the dam. Number 3. My Way killings. Frank Sinatra's My Way spent 75 weeks as a top 40 hit and another 49 weeks in the top 75. The song was arguably Sinatra's biggest and most memorable hit ever, and is still popular to this day. Maybe even too popular, at least in the Philippines. Bad things happen to people who sing it there. Between the years 2002 and 2012, upwards of a dozen people were killed in connection to My Way. In the Philippines, karaoke is both very popular and very serious. Serious enough that at least one of those 12 people was killed for singing the song out of tune. It was reported at the time that the song had already been taken off numerous playlists because violence kept breaking out when people sang it poorly. Another victim was stabbed in 2008 when a fight broke out before the song even started. In another incident, a 4-year-old was singing the song, adults started arguing, and one man was attacked with a meat cleaver. The only common theme is the choice of song, it seems, making it quite a deadly coincidence with little reason for the deadly acts beyond the arrogant lyrics making people angry. Number 2. The Taxi Brothers. Many stories of amazing coincidences are too good to be true. Do some digging and they begin to fall apart. But one popular tale of two brothers killed a year apart by the same taxi driver carrying the same passenger may actually be the real deal. The incident supposedly took place in Bermuda in 1975, so records are a bit hard to come by, but internet sleuths wanting to get to the bottom of the story have dug around to find the clues. A story from The Telegraph in 1975 does present the incident as fact. Both brothers were 17 at the time of their death, both riding the same scooter on the same road 1 year apart. Other reports mention the name of the taxi driver and even sections of the road on which the boys were hit. Though verifiable details are hard to come by, a 1974 newsletter from a Bermuda workers' union does offer a small message of sympathy after the death of a 17-year-old with the same name from the original story, which gives the whole thing a lot of credence. Number 1. Umberto and Umberto. In The Prince and the Pauper, Mark Twain created a tale of two identical men who swap places. One royalty, the other a poor commoner. Sounds fantastical and implausible, which makes the story of King Umberto of Italy and Umberto the restaurateur so unbelievable. According to the story, the king went to a restaurant to have a meal. The owner wanted to meet the king, and the men were stunned to notice that they looked exactly alike. They shared the same name and the same birthday. Both married women named Margarita on the same day. The day after their meeting, King Umberto was assassinated. He was shot 4 times. The two men were scheduled to meet that day, but it never panned out. Umberto, the restaurant owner, had also died that morning, also after being shot. If the story is true, it's quite the coincidence indeed. The two men very well could have been twin brothers without knowing it, but the death of a random restaurant owner in the year 1900 did not cause many waves, especially on the same day as the king was assassinated, so details of his life, if he even existed, have been lost. Given how many humans have existed in the world and how many events and incidents, both big and small, happen every day, history is littered with examples of strange coincidences. But the ones we will be looking at today are so unusual that they strain credulity, and should they have come from the pages of a book, they would have been deemed contrived or just unbelievable. Number 10. Poe's Tale of Cannibalism. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe wrote and published the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It wasn't one of his better-known works, and even the writer himself later dismissed it as a very silly book. Basically, it tells the story of the eponymous character after he becomes a stowaway on a ship called the Grampus. At one point, the ship wrecks during a storm and only 4 men survive and are washed ashore. With no food whatsoever, after a few days, they resort to the most drastic solution: cannibalism. They draw straws, and the unlucky one is a young man named Richard Parker, who is killed and then eaten. At first, this would seem like a straightforward, albeit grisly story, but then we move forward about 46 years and something strange happens. In 1884, a yacht called the Mignonette left England, headed for Sydney, Australia. Carrying 4 men, it also shipwrecked and left the seafarers stranded with no food. As a last resort, they also cannibalized one of their own, a young 17-year-old named Richard Parker. The only main difference was that the survivors saw no need to draw straws, as the real-life Parker had fallen ill after drinking seawater and was considered a goner. Eerie coincidences aside, the case that followed after the remaining men were rescued and arrested for murder represented a landmark ruling in English law. It stated that necessity does not excuse murder, meaning you cannot kill someone else to save your own life. Number 9. Where the war began and ended. On July the 21st, 1861, the First Battle of Bull Run marked the first major engagement in the American Civil War. Of course, the war was horrible for many people, but it was a particularly strange inconvenience for one wholesale grocer named Wilmer McLean. He lived on a plantation near Manassas, Virginia, and the Bull Run River passed right through his land. In fact, most of the battle took place on his property, and the Confederate leader, General P.G.T. Beauregard, even commandeered McLean's house to use as his headquarters. Obviously, McLean and his family couldn't live in the middle of a war, so they relocated. A few years later, they were residing in a house near a village called Appomattox Courthouse. As it happens, this is where the last battle of the Civil War took place. Afterwards, Confederate General Robert E. Lee officially surrendered to Union leader Ulysses S. Grant, and he did so in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's new home. The McLeans later moved back to their previous estate and simply abandoned their house in Appomattox County. They also defaulted on the loans they took out to buy it, so Surrender House, as it came to be known, was confiscated and sold at auction. Today it operates as a museum and is a designated National Historical Monument. As for Wilmer McLean, he liked to say that the Civil War began in his front yard and ended in his front parlor. Number 8. The Curse of Tecumseh. Ever since 1840, American presidents have died according to a pattern which is remarkable enough that people have ascribed it to a curse. Every president who is elected in a year ending in a 0, something which happens every 2 decades, is fated to die in office. First was William Henry Harrison, elected in 1840. He died of pneumonia a month after being sworn in. Then in 1860 came Abraham Lincoln, and we all know how that ended. In 1880, James Garfield was elected president, and he was also assassinated by a man named Charles Guiteau. William McKinley might have escaped this alleged curse if he stuck at just 1 term. Alas, in 1900 he was elected president to his 2nd term, and a year later he was shot and killed by an anarchist. Next up was Warren G. Harding, who suffered a stroke 3 years after being elected in 1920. Afterwards came Franklin Roosevelt, who passed away of cerebral hemorrhage in 1945. While he did die in office, he didn't actually die during the term which allegedly sealed his fate. And last but not least, there was JFK, who won the 1960 election and whose assassination is all too well known. As you can see, 7 presidents followed this extraordinary pattern. Many see it as what it probably is, a series of incredible coincidences, but others claim it is a curse placed on William Henry Harrison by Tecumseh, leader of the Shawnee people, for the former's role in Tecumseh's rebellion. Ronald Reagan would have been next in line. He was elected in 1980, and although someone did try to kill him, he survived his injuries and died of old age decades after he left office. Even if the curse was real, it appears that he broke it. Number 7. The Church Explosion. At 7:25 p.m., March 1st, 1950, the West Side Baptist Church in Beatrice, Nebraska, exploded due to a natural gas leak ignited by the fire from the furnace. It was Wednesday, and every Wednesday at 7:20 p.m. sharp, the church choir gathered there to practice. People were expecting expecting the worst as they approached the smoking rubble, but it soon became apparent that nobody had been injured in the blast. Even though the choir director was very strict about tardiness, on this particular night, none of the 15 choir members arrived on time. It wasn't one single thing that caused the delays either, but rather a series of minor occurrences that detained each person enough to evade the deadly blast. The Reverend and his family, for example, were late because his wife had to iron a dress at the last moment. Two sisters both had car trouble. Two high school girls wanted to finish listening to a radio program while another student was struggling with her geometry homework. The pianist fell asleep after dinner. A man was late because he wanted to finish writing a letter he kept putting off, while one woman was simply feeling lazy because it was cold outside and her home was warm and cozy. And so went all the other excuses. Unsurprisingly, given the nature of the circumstances, some people considered it divine intervention. Number 6. Right place, right time. Joseph Figlock became a hero of Detroit due to a bizarre series of events that happened over the course of a year. One morning in 1937, Figlock was at his job as a street sweeper when he was struck by something that landed on his head and shoulders. That something was a baby girl who fell out of a 4-story window. Because Figlock broke her fall, the infant survived her drop that otherwise would have almost surely been fatal. A year later, the street sweeper was back at his job when he was again hit by a falling object. You guessed it, it was another baby. This time it was 2-year-old David Thomas who fell out of his window on the 4th floor. This baby did sustain some injuries, but once more had escaped certain doom thanks to Joseph Figlock being in the right place at the right time. Now, good news for you, you're in the right place at the right time right now, because today I want to tell you about our fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. If you're enjoying this video, then why not try out CuriosityStream for free and check out their docuseries called The Butterfly Effect, which, as you can probably guess, is a series which looks at what would happen if certain major world events had not happened. Like, what if there was no Cold War, or what if Martin Luther King had never been assassinated? It's things like that. It's a really great series. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms: web app, Roku, Android, Xbox One smart TVs, iOS, Chromebooks, the list goes on. It's also available worldwide. You can get unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month, and for you guys, the first 30 days are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/TopTenz and use the promo code TopTenz during the sign-up process. It's a great way to support the show. It keeps us making more videos, and I really couldn't think of a better fit for a channel like this. And let's get into the top 5. Number 5. Miss Unsinkable. Violet Jessup was born in Argentina to Irish immigrants in 1887. When she turned 21, she found work as a ship stewardess and, in 1911, secured a position on board the RMS Olympic, the first of the Olympic-class ocean liners built by the White Star Line at the start of the century. At the time, these were the largest, most luxurious ships in the world. Jessup was probably thrilled with her new job, but pretty soon she might have reconsidered her fortunes. In September 1911, Jessup was on board the Olympic when it collided with a warship called the HMS Hawke. The collision wasn't too bad, and the ocean liner managed to make it to port without any fatalities. This incident didn't deter Jessup from continuing her career as a stewardess. Although she was content to board the Olympic, her friends persuaded her that it would make for a much more exciting experience to work on board the White Star Line's new ocean liner. After all, the vessel was proclaimed to be unsinkable, and of course its name was the Titanic. You already know how this went down. Literally, just 4 days into its maiden voyage, the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. Jessup survived the ordeal as she was lowered down into Lifeboat 16, which was later picked up by the RMS Carpathia. She later recalled that as the boat was being lowered, an officer put a baby in her lap. Later aboard the Carpathia, a woman leaped at her, snatched the baby and ran. Jessup always assumed that this was her mother, but she never saw either one of them again. Then World War II started, and Jessup served as a nurse for the British Red Cross. She worked aboard the Britannic, which was the third and last of the Olympic-class ocean liners and had been repurposed into a hospital ship. In 1916, the vessel suffered damage from a mine explosion and sank in the Aegean Sea. For the third time in just 5 years, Violet Jessup had survived a shipwreck, retroactively earning her the nickname Miss Unsinkable. Number 4. The Opposing Graves. Just outside of the Belgian town of Mons sits the St. Symphorien civilian military cemetery, which serves as the final resting place of over 500 soldiers who died in the First World War. Many of these men perished in the Battle of Mons, which took place on August 23, 1914, and is considered to be the first major action of the British Army in the war. One of these men, however, died a little earlier. John Parr was a private who was born in London and lied about his age so that he could enlist. He served as a reconnaissance cyclist and scouted the area ahead of his battalion. However, he was gunned down by enemy fire and died on August 21st at only 17 years of age. He is generally considered to be the first British serviceman killed in action during the First World War. His grave is at St. Symphorian, and opposite of it, just a few yards away, is the grave of Private George Ellison. He died years later on November 11th, 1918. This date is significant because it is in fact the day that Germany and the Allies signed an armistice, bringing an end to the war. George Ellison was killed just 90 minutes before peace was declared, thus giving him the unfortunate distinction of being the last British soldier killed in the war. These two graves face each other, although this was done completely unintentionally, as nobody was aware of their first and last positions when they were buried. Number 3. Death at Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was one of the greatest, most ambitious engineering projects of its day, but it came with a heavy price as a lot of people died during its construction. Exactly how many is a matter of debate. Officially, the death toll was 96, but historians argue that the real number would be much higher because the official version didn't take into account workers who died off-site of construction-related injuries or illnesses. An inquiry by the US Bureau of Reclamation increased the number to 213 deaths between 1921 and 1935. The first fatality was a surveyor named John Gregory Tierney, who drowned in the Colorado River on December 20th, 1921, after he got caught in a flash flood. Technically, another worker named Harold Connolly died first, but his demise was completely unconnected with the project as he drowned in the river when he was swimming. Here is the truly tragic part. The last fatality registered during construction of the Hoover Dam occurred on December 20th, 1935, exactly 14 years to the day after Tierney drowned when a 25-year-old electrician's helper plummeted 320 feet from one of the intake towers. That man was Patrick Tierney, the surveyor's son. Number 2. The King and his double. Some say that we all have a doppelganger somewhere in the world, a person who isn't related to us in any way, but they look just like us. King Umberto I of Italy found his doppelganger in 1900 when he went to eat at a little restaurant in Monza. He discovered that the proprietor looked almost exactly like him, but more than that, they had been born on the same day. At this point, you'd probably think this was most likely a case of twins separated at birth, but the coincidences didn't stop there. Both men had married women named Margarita and had sons named Vittorio. Moreover, the restaurant owner had opened his establishment on the day of King Umberto's coronation. Shocked to his core by these revelations, the king invited his doppelganger, or long-lost twin maybe, to an event taking place the next day. Sadly, neither one made it. The next morning, the restaurateur was killed under unexplained conditions. Just hours later, when King Umberto found out about his demise, he was assassinated by an anarchist. Number 1. The Writer and the Comet. The life of American writer Mark Twain has been inexorably linked to the passing of Halley's Comet from beginning to end. The famous comet visits us every 75 to 76 years. It will next be visible in 2061, but a noteworthy appearance happened in November 1835. Just 2 weeks after its perihelion, meaning the point of its orbit which is closest to the sun, Samuel Langhorne Clemens was born in Florida, Missouri. He would go on to adopt the pen name Mark Twain and become one of America's most celebrated authors. Throughout his life, Twain took a keen interest in science and was well aware of his connection to Halley's Comet. In the early 20th century, the writer was getting on in years and knew that the end was near. However, he also knew that the comet was due to pass by Earth again soon, and he was convinced that he would not die before that happened. As he put it, "Now there are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together." He could not have been more right. Mark Twain died on April 21st, 1910, just one day after Halley's Comet reached its perihelion. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash.
Top 10 most remarkable coincidences in history. Number 10. Two Finnish brothers. This one is strange no matter what way one looks at it. In 2002, a pair of 70-year-old identical twin brothers from Raal, Finland, were hit and killed by trucks while riding their bicycles in a snowstorm. The catch? They were killed in separate accidents on the same day, along the same stretch of road, only about a mile apart. Additionally, as the second accident occurred just 2 hours after the first, the second brother hadn't even learned of the fact that his brother had just been killed earlier, thereby eliminating suicide as a possible explanation and making this truly one for the record books. Of course, unusual coincidences between identical twins are not unheard of. There are dozens of cases on record of twins separated at birth, reuniting later to discover they possess similar mannerisms, food preferences, work at similar jobs, etc., and, in one case, even married and divorced spouses with the same name, and then remarried another person also with the same name. So why not die the same way, on the same day, on the same road? Makes sense to me. Number 9. The Kennedy-Lincoln link. This one is an old story, but worth recounting because it is so unusual. It revolves around an unusual number of coincidences that occurred between Presidents Kennedy and Lincoln in regards to their assassination. For example, both men were elected 100 years apart, Lincoln in 1860 and Kennedy in 1960. They were both succeeded by Southerners named Johnson, and the two Johnsons were born 100 years apart, Andrew in 1808, Lyndon in 1908. Both assassins were born 100 years apart, Booth in 1839 and Oswald in 1939, and both died before they could be brought to trial. Lincoln was shot in a theater and his assassin was cornered in a warehouse, while Kennedy was shot from a warehouse and his assassin was captured in a theater. Finally, Lincoln was shot in Ford's theater, while Kennedy was shot while riding a Ford Lincoln. And, to top it all off, Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, Evelyn Lincoln, while Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. The list goes on from there and has been the source of considerable debate ever since. Of course, mathematicians have been quick to spoil all the fun by trying to show how all these things were bound to happen despite the long odds, which is why most people consider mathematicians poor party conversationalists. Number 8. Gavril Princip and the Archduke. It's unlikely the 20-year-old Bosnian peasant realized that his actions would set the course for the rest of the 20th century, but that's exactly what it did when the man took out his pistol and shot twice at the motorcade carrying Austro-Hungarian leader Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, one beautiful June day in 1914. Killing both of them, their deaths set off a chain of events that would plunge the world into one of the bloodiest wars in history and sow the seeds for the advent of communism and Nazism over the next few decades. And the sad thing is, it need never have happened except for a single, remarkable coincidence. Princip, it turns out, was part of a band of conspirators intent on killing the Archduke that day, but he had largely given up once the day's earlier attempt to kill the man with a bomb failed. Ducking into a cafe for a quick bite to assuage his disappointment, as well as his appetite, he had just stepped outside when he spotted the Archduke's car stopped before his very eyes not 20 feet away. The driver had apparently taken a wrong turn, and, in the process of backing up, he had killed the engine, leaving the Archduke and his wife sitting ducks. Thinking quickly, he pulled his pistol, and the rest, as they say, is history. All because the Archduke drivers got lost, and Princip had a taste for Bologna. Number 7. Double homicide, 157 years apart. In a somewhat grisly coincidence, it seems that two women, Barbara Forrest and Mary Ashford, were both victims of a similar crime committed in the tiny village of Erdington, some 5 miles outside of Birmingham in England. Both 20-year-olds, who happened to share the same birthday, had been raped and strangled. Their bodies were found 300 yards apart, and both had been found on the same day, May the 27th, 157 years apart, 1817 and 1974. Even more remarkable, both had just visited a friend that evening, both had changed into a new dress that night, and both had gone to a dance, where they presumably met their killer. Still not remarkable enough for you, how about the fact that the man accused in both their crimes was named Thornton, and that both Thorntons were eventually acquitted for the crime? Reincarnation? Coincidence? Who knows? Number 6. Booth and Lincoln. No, not John Wilkes and Abraham, Edwin and Robert. Turns out that a few months before John Wilkes Booth obtained notoriety for murdering the president at Ford's Theatre, the president's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was waiting on a narrow, crowded platform for a train in Jersey City, New Jersey, when he lost his footing and fell beneath the slowly moving carriage of a departing train. Pulled to safety before any harm could come to him, he turned to thank his rescuer, and he was surprised to see it was the well-known actor, Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes. In what could only be considered one of the most remarkable coincidences in history, the son of a president was rescued by the brother of that president's assassin. But then, Lincoln's only surviving child had a knack for such coincidences, being present at the assassination of President Garfield in 1881. He was Garfield's Secretary of War at the time and an eyewitness to the event, and of President McKinley in 1901. I suspect invitations to the White House leveled off after a bit. Number 5. The Saga of the Mark Chapmans. In December of 1980, Beatles singer, songwriter, and guitarist John Lennon was shot and killed by an obsessed fan in front of the Dakota apartment complex in New York City. His assassin was a man named Mark Chapman, a schizophrenic night security guard and general loser who has been cooling his heels ever since in Attica Prison in upstate New York. 5 years later, NBC decided to do a biographical film about Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono, entitled John and Yoko: A Love Story. Unfortunately, the actor they hired to play Lennon, unbeknownst to them, happened to be named Mark Chapman, making for one of those "you gotta be kidding me" moments Hollywood occasionally suffers from. Once news of the fact broke, the studio quickly recast the role, presumably giving the part to someone who was not named Mark Chapman, and life went on as normal as possible for those who live in the Twilight Zone. However, Mark Chapman, the actor, not the crazed gunman, got his just rewards by playing Lennon in a 2007 dud called Chapter 27. Apparently, by then, looking like John Lennon, but having the same name as his assassin, was no longer considered weird, for some reason. Number 4. The deaths of Presidents Jefferson and Adams. Though both men turned out to be bitter political rivals later in their careers, Jefferson was Adams's vice president until he went on to beat his own boss in the election of 1800, the two men did share their love of country. As such, both men were instrumental in drafting the Declaration of Independence, which, as everyone knows, was first signed on July 4, 1776. What most people don't know, however, is that both men were also to die on the same day, July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day the document was first ratified. How's that for timing? Number 3. Crossword puzzle gives away D-Day invasion codewords. In what has to be one of the biggest longshots in history, in May of 1944, retired schoolteacher Leonard Dawes, who had been compiling the daily crossword puzzle for London's Daily Telegraph newspaper for over 20 years, put together a series of puzzles that somehow managed to include the names of two of the landing beaches, Utah and Omaha, along with several other super-secret code words like Overlord, Mulberry, and Juno. Nobody outside of General Eisenhower's staff was supposed to know. Assuming Dawes was a German agent, they instantly interrogated the man, only to release him a short time later once they became convinced the words were entirely randomly chosen. While the chances of inadvertently using one of the code words is not remarkable, Dawes' puzzle contained no fewer than 5 code words, all over the course of 2 weeks. The odds for such a thing happening has to be considered close to 1 in a billion, but I'll leave that for the mathematicians to figure out. Number 2. Titanic versus the Titan. In what has to be considered one of the most truly spooky coincidences of all time, in 1898, author Morgan Robertson, 1861 to 1915, wrote a novella entitled Futility, or Wreck of the Titan, in which he outlined the voyage of a British luxury liner, HMS Titan, that hits an iceberg while crossing the northern Atlantic and sinks with a large loss of life, in part due to the lack of sufficient lifeboats on board. The similarities between the fictional story and the real-life loss of the luxury liner with very nearly the same name 14 years later was extraordinary. Both the fictional Titan and the real Titanic were triple-screw luxury ships about 800 feet long that hit an iceberg in the month of April while traveling at around 25 knots, resulting in the death of some 2,500 souls. While not identical in every detail, in Robertson's story, the Titan capsizes and sinks quickly, while the Titanic remained upright and sank slowly over the course of a couple of hours, the similarities are nothing, if not amazing. Evidence of precognition? Impossible to say, but something to think about next time you read a Tom Clancy techno-thriller. Number 1. Lee Harvey Oswald employed at the Texas School Book Depository. There may be literally thousands of people out there at any given moment who would like to kill the President of the United States. Of these, only a tiny fraction possess the means to do so, skilled with a firearm or explosives, etc., and of those, almost none of them will ever be afforded the opportunity to do so. This is what makes Oswald's case so remarkable. Consider that he is an ex-Marine sniper with Marxist leanings and a desire to make himself famous by killing a world leader who purchases a high-powered rifle through the mail for $15 and then somehow gets a job at the one place the President of the United States' motorcade is going to pass within 50 yards of just a month beforehand. Quite a remarkable coincidence that was to provide Oswald, who already had the means and the motive, with the opportunity to commit one of the most heinous crimes in history, and one that remains controversial to this day. What if he hadn't got the job at the Schoolbook Depository building on October 16, 1963? Impossible to say for certain, but it's a near certainty he would not have had nearly the fine perch the city of Dallas was to provide him that sunny November afternoon. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button in the top right. Our channel has loads of other awesome videos just like this.
Scientifically speaking, coincidences aren't that peculiar, as we live in a world full of so many random occurrences. They seem weird because our brains are wired to spot patterns to predict future outcomes, in space as well as time, even if those patterns don't actually exist. As an example, in the early days, spotting the same mark on various trees in different locations may mean absolutely nothing, though it could also mean that a vicious predator is following you. According to our primitive yet cautious brains, why take the chance? However, that doesn't mean that all coincidences could be chalked up to our early man brains acting up. Our history is full of examples of coincidences so unlikely that they simply can't be explained by anything other than elaborate, supernatural conspiracy theories. Coincidences like... Number 7. Abraham Lincoln's son was once saved by John Wilkes Booth's brother. President Lincoln's assassination in 1865 at the hands of the famous stage actor John Wilkes Booth is one of the most discussed events in American history. We're not even talking about the various outlandish conspiracy theories surrounding it, as it's not that hard to believe that someone hated him enough to assassinate him. His death exposed and rather widened a fault line still visible in the country's politics and proved that the Civil War was still far from being completely won. What would come as a surprise to most, though, is that his death was also part of a bizarre coincidence. It involved his son, Robert, and John's brother, Edwin, who happened to be at the same train station around a year before the assassination. That's not weird, as there are only so many train stations that one can catch a train from, though what happens next is weird. As Robert was leaning on the train, waiting for his ticket, it suddenly started to move before he had a chance to balance himself. He almost fell inside the gap and injured himself, or worse, though was saved at the last moment by a random passerby. When he turned to thank him, it was none other than Edwin Booth. While we're not sure about the exact date of this event, we know that it happened sometime between 1863 and 1865, as it was confirmed by Robert himself in a letter to the editor of the now discontinued Century magazine. Number 6. The man who survived 2 atomic bombs. The end of the Second World War may seem like a long time ago to most people, though that's only until you read up on how many of its survivors are either still alive or who died fairly recently. Out of all of them, the survivors of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki have some of the most horrific tales to tell, as they went through possibly the worst form of warfare on a civilian population in human history. One of those survivors, however, was also one of the luckiest men in history, or one of the unluckiest, depending on how you look at it. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is perhaps the only recorded radiation survivor of the war to have survived both of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though they left him with some devastating medical ailments for the rest of his life. When he died at 93 in 2010, he was suffering from acute leukemia, loss of hearing in his left ear, cataracts, and a bunch of other issues as a direct result of the blasts. Number 5. 15 choir members failed to show for practice and survive an explosion. Beatrice in Nebraska, with its roughly 12,000 residents, is a fairly small town by all measures, and certainly not the kind of place you'd expect interesting things to happen. It would have stayed that way too, if not for a bizarre coincidence that happened back in 1950. On March the 1st, every member of the 15-member choir practice at local Westside Baptist Church happened to miss their 7:25 p.m. practice, something that had never occurred before. All of them had varying reasons for it too. The pastor and his family were late because the daughter had accidentally soiled her dress and the wife was ironing a new one. Another member missed it because they couldn't start their car on time. The pianist, who had actually planned to arrive early, fell asleep. 2 students couldn't be there because they had to catch the end of a particular radio program, and so on. What they didn't know, though, is that this bizarre series of events ended up saving all of their lives, as the church was hit by a strong natural gas explosion at exactly 7:27 p.m. While the building was badly damaged, no one ended up getting hurt or killed, as most of the members arrived after it happened. Number 4. Pearl Harbor could have been way worse. Even if quite a few people have probably heard of this one, it still warrants inclusion on this list because of the most bizarre coincidence in history. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a devastating event for the American military by all accounts, as well as the trigger for the USA to finally enter a war they'd been avoiding for a while. Unbeknownst to the Japanese military, though, the most important parts of the Pacific Fleet, the aircraft carriers, were not in the harbor at the time of the attack. All 4 of them were coincidentally out at sea or out of commission for one reason or another, as the Japanese Navy only encountered battleships and heavy cruisers. Mind you, that doesn't mean the attack wasn't still devastating for the fleet, as it destroyed hundreds of planes and and at least 20 warships stationed at the harbor at the time. If Japan had got to the carriers, though, what was a fairly damaging attack would have instead been a crippling blow to the entire American war effort. Number 3. Esther and the Dollar Bill. The unlikely story of Esther and the Dollar Bill has turned into an internet legend at this point, so much so that it's almost impossible to track down if it's even real. As we found out, it almost definitely is, as it was featured on an episode of This American Life. Paul and Esther were a couple about to get married in Chicago. Just before he was about to propose, he went to his local deli to eat his favorite meal. When he took a closer look at the dollar bill he was about to pay with, to his astonishment, the bill had Esther scribbled on it, which was already a freaky enough coincidence to be included here. It gets even weirder, however, when he asked her about it after they were married. As it turns out, she was the same Esther who had written it back when she was 19 and in the middle of a bad relationship. As a call to the universe, she wrote her name on around 10 bills and spent them at random places. If a man brought one of those back to her, she argued he'd be the one meant for her. And sure enough, that man turned out to be Paul. Number 2. The guy who missed 2 major plane accidents. 2014 was a particularly tumultuous year for Malaysian Airlines. For those who may remember, it was the year of the infamous disappearance of flight MH370 somewhere over the Indian Ocean with a total of 239 people on board. Shockingly, neither the black box nor any of the passengers on the plane have been found, despite perhaps the most costly search and rescue operation in aviation history, though that may be due to the sheer enormity of the oceans in the region rather than anything supernatural. Of course it's due to the enormity of the ocean. That's not it though, as flight MH17, another flight owned by Malaysian Airlines, was shot down over Ukraine in the very same year, killing all of the 298 people on board. While that would be coincidental enough on its own, we have a better one. One Dutch cyclist named Martin de Jong was supposed to get on both of those flights to go back to Malaysia, though changed his plans at the last minute on both occasions. These flights were on different routes, and the fact that they were both operated by Malaysian only makes it weirder. Number 1. The D-Day crossword mystery. Even if most people today know of the Normandy landings, perhaps the largest amphibian military operation in history, that wasn't the case when it was happening. Obviously, it was a top-secret mission, as otherwise, what would be the point, really? It was the entry point for the Allies to retake the Nazi-occupied territories of France and beyond, and if it failed, chances of that successfully happening via any other route were abysmally low. In case you haven't heard, the Nazis were fairly good at their jobs. What most people don't know, though, is how close we got to almost cancelling the whole plan thanks to the regular crossword puzzle column of the Daily Telegraph. Against all reason, the solutions to the puzzle contained many secret code words for the operation, including code for the name of the precise location of the invasion, as well as the working code for the entire operation, among others. No one would have noticed it if it wasn't for an officer who took his daily crosswords seriously. While it did create quite a stir among the Allied forces, as spies were one of the biggest threats for both sides throughout the war, it turned out to be no more than a huge coincidence. The author of the puzzle was actually an innocent and presumably bewildered teacher living in Surrey. All of the solutions matching the top secret codes just happened to match and be published just before the landings. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, brand new videos just like this.